All right, so when you think about how India gained its independence, what comes to mind? Probably Mahatma Gandhi, right? Nonviolence, the Quit India movement. That's the story most of us know. But what if that's not the whole story? Today, we're going to dig into a source that flips that narrative on its head and asks some pretty tough questions about one of the most important moments in modern history.
So here's how we're going to break this down. We're looking at 4 main points that this article from India Facts makes. First, we'll get into this idea of a distorted history. Then we'll uncover a really surprising revelation from the British Prime Minister himself. After that, we'll take a closer look at a very famous movement. And finally, we'll see how the source ties all this together into what it calls a legacy of appeasement.
Okay, so let's just start with the big question, right? If the story we all learned isn't the full picture, then what really made the British Empire suddenly pack its bags and leave India in 1947? I mean, what was the real trigger? The source we're looking at today has a very different answer than what you'd probably find in a textbook.
And the source material for all this is an article called Distorting the History of the Freedom Movement. And its main argument, its core idea, is that the story of India's independence has been, well, carefully shaped, maybe even manipulated, to make certain figures and movements look good while pushing others into the shadows.
All right, so let's get into the first big claim. The article really starts by pointing out what it calls major distortions in the way this history is usually told. And we're going to jump right in with a huge one.
So here's where the two stories really clash. On one hand, you have the common belief, right, that the Quit India movement of 1942, led by Gandhi, was the final push that got the British to leave. But the article says, hold on a second. That movement had pretty much fizzled out by the end of 1942. Yet independence didn't happen for another 5 years. So, what was really going on in that gap? And this leads us to what the article presents as its bombshell piece of evidence. And it's interesting because it doesn't come from an Indian historian or a freedom fighter. It comes from the man who actually signed off on Indian independence, the British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. You see, according to an account mentioned in the article, Attlee was asked directly, point blank, what was the real impact of Gandhi's activities on the British decision to leave? And his response, apparently with a smile, was just one word: minimal. I mean minimal. That one word just completely challenges the foundation of the whole nonviolence narrative.
So, okay, if Attlee thought Gandhi's impact was minimal, then who or what was the major factor? Well, the article argues that the British weren't worried about nonviolent protests. They were worried about someone else entirely, Subhas Chandra Bose. And here's the key, according to the source. It wasn't about civil disobedience, it was about the fear of military disobedience. Bose's Indian National Army, the INA, it completely changed the game. It started to erode the loyalty of the Indian soldiers serving the British. Suddenly they were seeing themselves not as soldiers of the empire, but as patriots of a future India. And this all came to a head with the naval mutiny in 1946. That's when the British faced their absolute worst nightmare, losing control of the very military that was holding their empire together.
And just to give you a sense of the scale of that nightmare, check out this number. By the end of World War II, there were 3 million trained Indian soldiers. 3 million. An army of that size, with its loyalty suddenly up for grabs, that's not something you can control. That's a ticking time bomb. The article's point is that the British saw the writing on the wall and decided it was time to get out before the whole thing blew up in their faces.
Okay, let's switch gears to the article's second major argument. This one re-examines one of Gandhi's most famous campaigns, the non-cooperation movement in the early 1920s. Now, most of us were taught that this was all about fighting for India's freedom. But the source we're looking at says, nope, its main purpose was actually something completely different.
What the article claims is that the non-cooperation movement was launched primarily to support something called the Khilafat movement. And what was that? It was a campaign by Indian Muslims to pressure the British government. They wanted to restore the Sultan of Turkey as the Caliph, the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, after he was defeated in World War I. So not an Indian issue, but an international one.
And to back this up, the author highlights 2 key things. First, that Gandhi actually put a resolution for Swaraj or self-rule on the back burner specifically to support the Khilafat. And second, that a big chunk of the money raised for India's independence, the Tilak Swaraj Fund, was rerouted to this external cause instead.
But here's the twist. The movement was basically doomed from the start because Turkey itself, the country at the center of it all, abolished the caliphate. So what happened in India? Well, according to this article, it didn't just fizzle out peacefully. The built-up energy and agitation erupted into violence, leading directly to the Mappila Rebellion in Kerala, a really brutal episode that, the source argues, often gets glossed over. And to really drive home how brutal this rebellion was, the source quotes Sir Sankaran Nair, who was an eyewitness. He wrote, "For sheer brutality on women, I do not remember anything in history to match the Malabar Rebellion. The atrocities committed are so horrible and unmentionable." I mean, that's a powerful and chilling account of the violence that followed the collapse of this movement that Gandhi had championed.
And that brings us to the article's final point. It argues that the way the Khilafat movement was handled wasn't just a single mistake. Instead, it set a dangerous precedent, a political strategy that would have devastating consequences for years to come.
So what was the big takeaway from all this? Well, according to the source, the real lesson other political leaders learned was that the threat of violence worked. The article claims they saw that the Congress Party would rather appease its opponents than risk confrontation, establishing a pattern for the future.
And the article traces this pattern, this alleged policy of appeasement, right through the next few decades. It starts with the Caliphate in 1921, then it points to 1948 when the Nehru government paid 55 crore rupees to Pakistan while the two countries were literally at war over Kashmir. And then it points to the 1950s and India's policy on Tibet. The source connects these dots to paint a picture of a consistent and, in its view, damaging political strategy. So look, the perspective in this article is without a doubt a challenging one. It pushes back hard against the history many of us grew up with. It doesn't claim to have all the answers, but it sure forces us to ask a really fundamental question. Because history isn't just a list of dates and events, right? It's a narrative, it's a story. And maybe the most important question we can ask is, who gets to write that story?